Welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Alec Cooley and I'm a senior advisor here with Busch Systems, and you're joining us for today's program, Changing Behavior, Case Studies and Best Practices to Influence Zero Waste Behavior. This is part of our regular or semi-regular green thinking webinar series that Busch Systems does. At the end of the program, I'll tell a little bit more about some of our past programs and how you can access those. But for now, I welcome you to today's program. So to set up this topic and what we're going to be talking about today, behavior is a complex thing when it comes to getting people to participate with recycling, with composting, waste prevention, other zero waste activities. We know from surveys, many surveys and research has shown that most people support and they're inclined to participate with recycling or reuse and other practices. And yet we know from hard experience that many don't. So how do we convert those people is the big question. In some cases, it's people who are confused. They don't understand the system, but they want to. They just need information. And that's really the basis of a lot of the effort that municipalities, universities, and others do to engage people is with outreach efforts is just that basic what and how education messaging. We also know that there are some people who simply aren't going to participate. It's not in their wheelhouse, they're not interested. And those folks we generally tend not to focus on because we don't need to waste our effort. We're looking for those people sort of in the middle who we know we can convert, who we can get to participate. And that's a substantial group. People who I like to think of them as almost sort of they're eligible to participate. Either they're open to the idea or they can be nudged to do it if they have the right messaging or the situation is set up in a way that will facilitate that. So that's going to be the focus of today's program. We're going to be looking at different strategies of how we get these, quote, eligible people to engage more with zero waste behavior. If we can go to the next slide. We have two speakers and presentations. I'm really excited for today. First, we're going to hear from Jennifer TABANICO, who is the president of Action Research. Jennifer will introduce her firm more in a moment, but briefly, Action Research is a marketing firm that specializes in sustainable behavior change. How do you engage that? So Jennifer is going to give us sort of an overview and talk in depth more about community-based social marketing. And then we're going to hear after that from Gretchen ENGBRING, who is a social scientist and with the Office of Sustainability at Stanford University. And Gretchen's going to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that Stanford uses to engage people in sustainability and specifically with waste reduction programs. So I'm excited to hear from both of them. There's a lot of great information here, so we're going to jump into it in a moment. Next slide. I do want to just remind folks, if you're not familiar with Busch Systems, we are a manufacturer and we sell a fine line of recycling and waste bin products for indoor, outdoor, many different settings. We keep sort of a firewall between the marketing side and these programs, but I do want to let folks know that at the very end, if you're interested to stay on after we're done with the presentations, we'll be joined by my colleague, Sarah Hawthorne, who is a business development manager with our sales team, and she's going to do a quick product demo and walk people through some of the things that the bins products that Busch Systems has. So if you're interested, so inclined, please stick around at the end for that. Next slide. As with all these programs, obviously everybody's muted, so but we do want to encourage as much interaction as possible. I want to make a distinction with your Zoom, the control bar there. Just between the chat and the Q&A. Chat, we encourage folks to get in there and just engage, react to what the speakers are saying, or riff off of things you've heard from others, share your own experience. Those are all great things to save in there. We actually will sort of curate and save a version of the chat discussion for folks to access after the program. But if you have a question that you specifically would like to have Jennifer or Gretchen respond to, just make a point to put that into the Q&A box separately. That's where I'm going to be looking in to pull out questions that will for the most part be addressing at the very end of the program. So just keep that in mind. We will have the recording as well as the slide deck will be posted online to our website within the next day or so, and we'll send out a link to everybody who's registered so you can come back and access those if you have to drop off early for whatever reason or want to share it with colleagues. So have that in mind. Periodically during the program, I'm going to be dropping links into the chat. There might be points that Jennifer or Gretchen refers to, and so I'll be sharing some of those links to some of these resources. We'll also have those same resources will all be posted online with the recording and all after the program. So just keep that in mind. And with that, we can go to the next slide. I'm going to go ahead and turn right over to Jennifer TABANICO. Again, Jennifer is the president with Action Research, and I'll let Jennifer take it from there.
Hey. Turning my video back on. There we go. Lots of buttons to navigate. Thank you, everyone, for having me. Again, I'm Jennifer TABANICO, and I'm going to talk to you today about what is at the heart of a lot of our waste reduction and recycling challenges, and that is human behavior. And specifically, I'm going to introduce community-based social marketing as an evidence-based framework for driving behavior change and helping us to reach some of these outcomes. Apologies, I'm trying to... Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. So a little bit about my company. We were founded in 2001, and I've dedicated my work entirely to this mission of applying knowledge from behavioral and social science research to outreach programs that promote safe, healthy, and sustainable communities. So our entire product is behavior change, and really have applied community-based social marketing principally across a wide range of behaviors, including waste reduction and recycling. So I'll be drawing from a lot of that experience and sharing that with you today. So the first point I like to make is that even though waste reduction and recycling are typically thought of as technology challenges or policy challenges, at the heart of those challenges is really human behavior. And that's true of a lot of our environmental problems. When you really look at climate change or air pollution, waste, water, it almost always comes down to a human decision and or human behavior. And within waste and recycling, it gets actually pretty complex. We have sorting behavior. So recycling requires that people sort correctly a wide range of items, an infinite number of items almost, into various categories. And they have to do that repeatedly across various contexts, at work, at home, while traveling, at various events. That turns out to be many, many different behaviors. Waste reduction also involves a wide range of behaviors, from bringing reusables to refusing packaging to repairing items instead of purchasing new ones, and so on. So I like to state that simply as environmental problems or waste problems are really behavior problems. And given that they are behavior problems, one of the challenges is that the vast majority of the solutions out there have really come from the fields of engineering or planning or regulation. And while technology, infrastructure, and policy really set the stage for behavior, we can't ignore the actors. So let me tell you a little bit more about this. Within technology, industry may develop a new compostable plastic, but the efficacy of that in reaching our waste reduction goals requires municipalities maybe to adopt new systems, and it requires individuals to properly sort that material into the compost bins. Similarly, we may have plastic alternatives for takeout containers that function really well, but restaurants must adopt them. We can have smart bins that tell people where to put items, but people must interact with those bins. So technology is great, but we cannot ignore the role of human behavior with that solution. And that's true also of infrastructure. Imagine a curbside food scrap collection program to really help divert organics from the landfill. Well, that's only going to work if households collect their scraps, remove the contaminants, place them in the bin, and take that bin out to the curb on a collection day. So lots of behaviors embedded in that, or retail kiosks for batteries or light bulbs or grocery bags will require people to remember to bring those things in. And then the final approach is policy. Policy is an excellent way to get us to these bigger goals, bans on single-use plastics, for example. Yet that still depends on compliance, individuals engaging in that behavior, And I think more importantly, it takes time to get those policies in place. And so often we can rely on voluntary behavior change while we work to enact policies to bring along those others that Alex spoke of, those that are going to be really difficult to change. So not only does behavior matter, but it's a behavior problem, our solutions also involve behavior. And given that we're dealing with a behavior problem, how have we primarily gone about changing behavior? Well, the vast majority of what's out there has relied heavily on what I call information intensive campaigns. So this is, we deliver brochures, we create websites, we purchase advertisements, and we push all of this information out to let people know what goes in the bin. Maybe we have classroom presentations to educate kids, hoping that they come home and tell their parents what goes in the bin. And we put social media posts and campaigns to boost concern about waste and hope that people will switch to reusables or reduce their use of plastics, or simply just have more favorable attitudes about recycling. So they take kind of two approaches. One is a knowledge-based approach, and that is if we just tell people what to do, they will do it. And so that's where we're kind of pushing information out, hoping that people will have this, oh, I know, and they will certainly act. But what we know from lots and lots of research is that simply knowing how to do something or knowing about its importance is often not sufficient motivation for behavior change. The other sort of past way is with these approaches is an attitude approach. And this is based on this belief that if people just care about this enough, if they just care about recycling, if they see that it's effective, if they care about the environment, they will certainly change their behavior. But again, simply having favorable attitudes about recycling or waste reduction doesn't necessarily translate to behavior change. So here's a scenario that many of you may have experienced, and that is where a city goes out and they develop beautiful brochures or flyers or bill inserts, and they distribute it to every single household. And then they conduct follow-up surveys, and they find that most residents can correctly identify recyclable items, and most residents have strong attitudes about recycling, yet when you look in the bin or you look at what's coming back to facilities, contamination rates don't change or recycling rates stay stagnant. Well, why is that? Well, what I like my answer to that is because likely the failure to engage in those behaviors was not just about knowing or just about caring. It was about other barriers like convenience, concerns or challenges around specific items, or even just beliefs about whether other people are also participating in the behavior. So many studies have shown this pattern. And I think the takeaway is that while knowledge and attitudes are important foundations, people don't act solely on what they know or believe. And knowledge and attitudes represent just two of the barriers to behavior change. So what do we do if knowledge and attitude change are not enough? What I'm going to talk through the rest of this presentation is a framework called community-based social marketing. And notice that I'm talking about this as a framework. Community-based social marketing is a process and not a tactic. It emerged just about 30 years ago from an environmental psychologist by the name of Doug Mackenzie Moore, who many of you are likely familiar with. And so even though it's been used for only about the last couple of decades, the origins of community-based social marketing are grounded in 100 or more years of research in social and environmental psychology. So it's not a new tactic. It is really just an evidence-grounded framework. Community-based social marketing is also, not surprisingly, community-based. And by that, I mean that the strategies that are developed using community-based social marketing are developed based on information gathered from the communities in which they're going to be delivered, and often rely on community mechanisms for information. So we're relying on things like social norms, perceptions about what other people are doing, as well as peer-to-peer communication. Community-based social marketing also focuses on removing barriers. And like I mentioned, knowledge and attitudes are just two of those barriers. But we provide a framework for how to unpack all of these other internal and external barriers that may exist. And then finally, community-based social marketing is behavior-based. From the very beginning, we're focused on, does behavior change? including very strategically picking which behaviors we're focused on. So while we're interested in increasing knowledge and favorable attitudes, at the end of the day, we want to change behavior. So I'm going to walk you through briefly what the steps are in community-based social marketing. It's a framework that consists of 5 steps, and it begins with selecting a behavior. And that turns out to be the most important step in this process, because if you pick the wrong behavior, or if your behavior is not linked to the outcome you're trying to change, you're never going to make a difference at the end. So a lot of things are involved at this first step. And the first is defining where is it that you're trying to go? Are you trying to reduce waste or what a particular item at the source? Are you trying to reduce contamination, increase diversion? So sitting down and identifying where are we going? What is the outcome? And then identifying who or what sector or what group is most connected to that outcome. And then third, what are they doing? What are all of the different actions? And often you'll find you have a long list of actions that people could potentially engage in. So if you think about food waste reduction behaviors or all of the different types of single-use plastic, there's a long list of behaviors. And so with this process, we also take time to narrow down that list based on an evaluation of their impact on the problem, the likelihood that we can change it or the probability of adoption. We look at the current rate of adoption. We want to identify behaviors where there's some room for movement, as well as their applicability in the population. So a lot goes into that step to make sure that what we're focusing on ultimately will get us to that goal. Why do we spend so much time at that step? Well, why can't we just throw everything in? Well, we know that if we give people a very long list of things that they potentially need to focus on, they're unlikely to do any of it. And there's some evidence to say they just get overwhelmed with all of the choices and decisions. Additionally, we find that barriers and the things that inhibit behavior change often exist at the level of individual items, individual actions when it comes to recycling and waste reduction. So narrowing down that list to a smaller segment of behaviors is really important. Next, we focus on identifying what are the barriers that inhibit the likelihood of action and what would the audience see as beneficial as of participating in that action. So we conduct research with the audience. That may be focus groups, interviews, surveys, a whole range of research efforts to really understand the audience. And importantly, we want to understand what does the audience perceive as beneficial, which sometimes is different than the reason for delivering the program. Only when we have a good understanding of those barriers and benefits, then, do we move to that third step of developing strategy. And that third step is where most agencies start their program. They have a regulatory requirement or a problem and jump right to development of strategy. So with this framework, we're kind of slowing that down with behavior selection and barrier and benefit research. But in my experience, when you've done those first 2 steps well, you will almost always know what to do with your strategy. It will self-present itself. And I'll show you 2 examples of that in a moment. Once we develop strategies, we pilot test them on a small scale to make sure that they're not only effective at changing the desired behaviors, but also cost effective. And only then, when we have identified cost-effective strategies, do we talk about implementing them broadly and continuing them to evaluate them across the community. So next, I'm going to walk through just 2 very brief case studies to show you how we move from selecting behaviors to developing a strategy. This first comes from a project I did probably about 10 years ago now, which was focused on both increasing diversion as well as reducing contamination in the city of Fort Worth in Texas. And they had this long-standing recycling program, but it really was kind of stagnant. Nothing was moving. So they already had been distributing broad information about recycling. So how are we going to move? So we wanted to identify what are the behaviors to focus on, and that was done through a waste characterization study. We looked in the trash and recycling bins of 415 randomly selected households. We wanted to see what's going in the trash that should be going in recycling and what's going in recycling that should be going into the trash. And while there are lots of different items, the greatest opportunity we found was mixed paper. We found that in 87% of the garbage carts, and it represented 8% of the waste. So that was an opportunity to make a shift. We then, of those homes that participated in the audit, Separately, those households were surveyed and asked about their barriers and perceived benefits to recycling specific types of items. And interestingly, we found that for mixed paper, the number one concern was privacy. They had a perception that people were going to look at their address and see their information if it was recycled. And they also had some confusion about shiny paper and plastic windows and the recyclability of that. In terms of benefits, they were already on board with recycling being the right thing to do and being good for the environment. Knowing that made it really easy to develop a strategy. We developed hang tags that were placed on the bin that pointed out a few things. First, we enhanced motivation by highlighting a social norm that 87% of other Fort Worth residents thought that recycling at home was very important. We also very specifically targeted the barriers and letting people know that they can recycle junk mail and envelopes, windows, magazines, glossy paper, so that item they were confused about. And then finally, let them know that they could cross out their private information if they were concerned about that going into recycling. Now, important point here is this isn't an actual barrier. This was just their perception. And sometimes people's perception is enough. So perception is reality when it comes to barriers. So if they think that people are going to be looking at their address and that's their concern, that perception alone can be enough. So we address that by providing them with a black marker, and that prompted that behavior. So you can see how we sort of build from behavior selection through strategy development. Here's another example from another context where we were addressing campus-wide waste, contamination of waste in a university environment. And in looking at the waste audits, we identified residence halls as having more contamination compared to other areas on campus. And 95% of the student body in this particular college, this is Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, lived in residence halls. So the vast majority of the audience on campus were actually disposing of waste and living in the residence halls. In terms of barriers and benefits, we asked people about their sorting of different items, and they were really confused about a few specific items, in particular things like microwavable plastic trays, cold cups, and clamshells, and they just were confused about what to do with those. There was also a lot of competition with other signage around bins, so sometimes barriers are external to the individual, and they don't have any control over that. In terms of benefits, again, they were already convinced. They were very motivated to be correct. This is a small liberal arts institution that prides itself on their sustainability, and they really wanted to do it right. They saw the benefits for the environment and the larger community. So how do we address this? Well, two ways. First, we developed a bin signage that just focused on the problem items. They were doing a lot of things right already. So we highlighted that. Most do the right thing. And we use 3D signage to really pull out those items that they were confused about and tell them specifically what to do with those items. We also wanted to continue to build a culture on campus, where you can see here the competition with some of the other signage and how this stood out. The second part of this campaign was to develop a sorting game. And this was leveraging another piece of community-based social marketing, which is, whenever possible, trying to leverage in-person, peer-to-peer communication. So they set up tabling in which students were asked to sort various items, the actual items, into different bins in sort of a game. And they were provided immediate feedback. So that's addressed their informational barriers, as well as allowed them to practice new habits in sorting these items. In addition to that, we wanted to build on this existing level of motivation to foster a positive social norm. So we leveraged that self-perception of I wanted to do the right thing, and had individuals pose with those items that they pledged to recycle correctly later on. And as you can see, those aggregate commitments posted together also created a positive social norm that other people on campus care, other people are going to be trying to get these into the right bin. So even though we have this very strategic evidence-based framework for developing strategies, from making sure we have the right behavior, from really understanding the behaviors, the barriers and benefits, and not assuming that we know what they are, it's still important to conduct a pilot test. We want to make sure that our strategies are effective and also cost effective. In another campaign that we did a few years ago, this is a new food waste collection program in the Salinas Valley in Central California. And so participation was already low because it was a brand new program. We couldn't rely on social norms. However, information was a key. So there were several different components. We needed to let people know what goes in the bins, what is the process for participating in this new program. And we included some normative information, letting them know that other people think this is an important new program. But there were a lot of different directions we could go. We talked about, well, should we give people a kitchen pail? Should we not give people a kitchen pail? What are all of the different elements? Should we deliver the pail in person? Could we just have them come pick it up? And as you can imagine, those would all have different costs associated with them. So in that pilot test, we had 3 different variations of a program that we tested, rolls it out to a small portion of the community for just a short period of time, and we looked to see, did behavior change? And the value of doing that, and one of the reasons I want to encourage when you're creating strategies to take time to pilot test, is that first you can see which behavior change strategy worked the best. And in this case, simply providing information alone, so that is an informational flyer about how to participate, resulted in 8% of households participating in the first few weeks after delivery of that program. If they were provided with a voucher, so they got the information and they also received a voucher to come pick up a pail that they could collect their food scraps, a kitchen pail, 11% participated. But if the pail was delivered to their front door, 21% delivered or participated. So delivering the pail to the door is going to be obviously more expensive than having them come pick it up. However, we can calculate a cost per behavior change. And what we found is that delivering the pail to the door along with the informational flyers, while it was the most expensive campaign, was the most cost effective, and in fact more cost effective than simply distributing a flyer, because you'd have to deliver so many more flyers to get the same level of participation. So really at pilot testing, the point I want to make there is that it's great for finding out if it worked, but also how broadly could you deliver this program? So the last couple of things I'll say about the utility of this process is that if you pilot test something and it's not working, it affords you the opportunity to go back and refine your strategy to figure out what worked, what didn't. Perhaps there were barriers that were not fully addressed or motivation wasn't quite sufficient. And you can fine tune and then repilot test. And this ends up being a cost saving mechanism because you haven't used all of your program funds to roll a program out across a community that's not having its intended effects. There's also feedback loops built into the barrier and benefit research that you do. If you find that the barriers are just too great, maybe there's a huge cost barrier or a convenience barrier, people aren't going to drive all the way to, say, a collection facility, you can revisit whether or not there are other behaviors you might be able to target where you can more effectively address barriers. So very brief overview of community-based social marketing. It may be a refresher for some of you on this call. It may be brand new to others, and there's a lot more to it, but I just wanted to introduce that as a viable approach for developing strategies. And the takeaways that I'd like you to walk away with are: first, behavior matters. That picking the right behavior and focusing on behavior, or focusing on the role of behavior as it relates to technology and infrastructure and policy, is critical. It's also important to recognize that barriers vary at the level of individual actions, and often that's individual items. So a person's reason for not bringing reusable utensils is likely different than their reason for declining a straw, is likely different than their reason for not putting the appropriate takeout container in the right bin. Community-based social marketing provides a structured, data-driven framework for developing strategies. It's not a tactic that you just add to your program and suddenly everything works. It's not a silver bullet sort of messaging approach, but rather an evidence-based framework. And then lastly, when you do have products or strategies that are cost-effective, those are the ones that you want to scale up across the community. So as I mentioned, there's lots more to learn about this approach. A few things I wanted to mention. First, I recently co-authored, along with the founder of Community-Based Social Marketing, Doug McKenzie-Moore, a 4th edition of Fostering Sustainable Behavior, which really introduces this framework and in all of its steps and shows its application across a wide range of behaviors. That was published at the beginning of this year, and the previous edition is 2011. So there's quite a few updates. If you are someone who's got the older book on your shelf, I think you'd be pleased with what we've added into that. I'd also suggest that you visit the CBSM website for lots of examples, case studies of this in action. And then finally, there is a course offered through the University of California, San Diego's Extension program. It's a sustainability and behavior change certificate program, but there is a course, one of those that I teach, called Behavior Change Strategies for Sustainability. Also, courses in conservation psychology and others that are applicable to those, to primarily practitioners who are on the ground facing these challenges every day. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to questions from you all later.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Lots of great information in there. You touched on a point that I know very well from when I was first starting my career at a university as a student volunteer. And I remember we would table out in our quad about getting people to recycle, and our message was 100% about care. It's going to save the environment, and it was there was the earnestness that we had as student volunteers was very intense. But as you pointed out, we learned pretty quick that did not seem to actually get the people who weren't our friends and who didn't already care to engage. So
yeah.
If we can pull up the live poll question, we have a quick one we want to put out there, just get a sense of what is everyone doing locally. We'd love to hear if your organization is already has implemented some form of behavior change campaign along the lines of what Jennifer is talking about, and making a distinction between sort of traditional outreach, recycling education, and more what we call this behavior change. So go ahead and make a note there if this applies to you. We'd love to hear it. Jennifer, just while folks are doing that, I made a reference, and you also did earlier, to the fact that there's some people who they're not going to engage. They're not interested. And generally, we think it's not worth the effort to go after those folks. But there are people who are sort of, there's a continuum. Can you touch a little bit about sort of how do we sort of understand where that dividing line is about somebody who, if somebody not already inclined to do it, can they be convinced on any level? Is there nuance there, or is that sort of a hard trying to actually drag somebody over, as it were?
Yeah. So really good questions. I would agree with you that the focus of our approaches tend to be that sort of middle. But one thing is that middle also divides itself into a lot of different segments. So I would caution against just saying, well, there's that one message is going to get everybody. As people are generally a function of their individual characteristics as well as their environments they're in. So there's lots there. But in terms of that sort of right end of those people that are just tough to move, I think that there are two ways. First, policy and regulation ultimately gets those individuals on board. The restaurant that, just finally has to now start collecting food scraps because they're going to be fined if they don't. But it's hard to go right to those policies. And that's where you can, by moving everybody else and getting all of those others on board on a voluntary basis, you're going to have a lot more support for those policies. But also, I think it's, we got to be careful not to assume that just because someone doesn't care that they're never going to do it. Sometimes people will just do the behavior because everybody else is doing it or for some other benefit, and it's often not the benefit that we care about. So they may be doing it for efficiency, or because now they're getting better scores on their health inspections or something like that, and have absolutely nothing to do with believing in recycling. So kind of two-parter there, but that would be how I would address those folks.
Yeah. That's helpful. Excellent. Well, if we can go ahead and turn off the poll and share the results for everyone. See, it was I would have expected. A good portion of folks do just the basic how-to recycling education, but it looks like roughly 26% have done CBSM style campaigns around food and compost specifically is the one that most have engaged with. But as I'm sure we'll come back to later on, it takes resources to do these kinds of programs, and so it's something that can have impact, but it's not immediately available for all programs. But let's go ahead and switch over then. Thank you, Jennifer. If we can turn this off and then flip over to Gretchen's presentation. I'll go and introduce Gretchen Marie ENGBRING, who is, again, a social scientist with the Stanford University's Office of Sustainability. And Gretchen, take it away.
All right, we're short on time here, so I'm going to get right into it. I need your help, and I don't want to stress anyone out here, but our planet depends on it, so no pressure. Today, I'm going to expand a little bit on Jennifer's presentation and use some of the work that myself and my team undertake at Stanford to illustrate the steps that you can take to design, implement, and assess your own behavioral interventions in the name of saving the planet, or just getting your kids to do their chores, up to you. So what do I do, you ask? It's my job to support campus sustainability, and in particular, pro-environmental and pro-social behaviors. And I do this by drawing on methodologies and findings from the social sciences. And I generally focus on 4 main areas. So the first there that you see is applied research here on campus, really focused on better understanding values, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors related to sustainability at Stanford, and testing the impact of these different initiatives and interventions on our campus community. The second is providing methodological support, like help designing surveys or supporting statistical analyses for other sustainability practitioners who are interested in conducting their own research. Third, I take the findings from the literature as well as our own research on campus, and I apply that to design of our campus communications, different programs, and other initiatives, including behavioral interventions designed to promote sustainability behaviors. And of course, last but not least, I try to share those experiences with others, not unlike we're doing today. Okay. So for today, I'm just covering a small piece of that job description and focusing on the tip of the behavioral iceberg, so to speak. We don't need to delve deeply into behavioral models. That's a different presentation. But to set the scene, I do want to draw your attention to that little pyramid on the left of your screen for a minute. This is the cognitive hierarchy model, something you've likely seen a version of before. And at the top of that pyramid are behaviors, which I assume you're all interested in, given the subject matter of the webinar. So behaviors like recycling an aluminum can, for example, tend to be more visible, measurable, and changeable. But there are also a lot of behaviors, and they tend to be very situation specific. So for example, you sort your waste when there are bins close and visible, right? When your passionate hippie environmental friend is watching you like a hawk, but not when those bins are farther away or harder to find. So below that are some of the deeper elements of culture and drivers of behavior. As we reach the bottom of that pyramid, these elements of culture get increasingly hard to change, but they often transcend situations, i.e. your values don't change based on your proximity to a recycling bin. Now, similarly, on the right side of your screen is the theory of planned behavior, or TPB. This is one of the more established and well-tested models of behavior. And again, the behavior is just the final product in that model. Then you have things like intentions, norms, attitudes, and perceived behavioral control driving that behavior. I bring both of these up because while today I'm going to be focusing on shifting specific environmental behaviors like waste sorting, the reality is that understanding what lies beneath can help you design more effective interventions. Additionally, sometimes it's actually those deeper drivers that we want to intentionally design for and shift. I'll touch on this once or twice in the presentation, and I'll circle back to this at the end to talk about some of the ways we're tackling those deeper drivers. But for now, let's just stick to the tip of that intervention iceberg. Okay, so here we go. What I have for you is a 12-step guide that more or less captures what I go through at Stanford when we encounter a behavior that we want to encourage or discourage. This is really compatible with and just builds on CBSM. So don't worry about reading all of these right now. Jennifer gave you a great intro. I just have these listed all together here so that when the slides are shared, you have the checklist to work through in one place. And what I am going to do is walk through these step by step with some examples from the Stanford campus that might help make the list a little bit less abstract. And for the sake of time, we'll largely focus on steps 1 through 5. especially because I really encourage you all to get out a pen, a piece of paper, open up a Word document, and I really want you to walk through the design of your own behavioral intervention right now while we're on the call. If you've done this before, I know many of you have, do it again. It might be a little slow, but personally, I learn something new every time I walk through this process, and it takes time. So you may as well use the webinar to feed two birds with one stone, so to speak, and come away with both some new knowledge and a plan. All right, everybody get ready, and here we go. All right. Okay, so we're going to start with step number 1 here. And what you're going to see is I want you to describe the problem you're trying to solve. Write this down, right? And I know the prompt alone is a little bit vague, so let's answer some clarifying questions like this one and walk through a Stanford example together. So for our campus, one challenge that we've been recently trying to tackle is laboratory waste. We're seeing really high levels of recyclable materials in our laboratory landfill bins. And part of the issue here is that it has a really disproportionate impact on campus sustainability. So our labs are generating something like 20% of our campus landfill waste, even though around 78% of that is actually recoverable. Now, let's ask ourselves, how is the target behavior contributing to this issue? I have an asterisk here because I'm somewhat skipping a step, and Jennifer mentioned this. I'm asking you to identify a target behavior, but the reality is that there are often lots of behaviors that contribute to this issue, from what our lab personnel purchase to the extent to which they use reusable, washable products in their experiments. So one step might be to actually brainstorm the different behaviors that you could target. For the sake of time, however, let's just go ahead and pick one, write one down for your own purposes. So in our case, we're going to focus on sorting behavior. That is the placement of items that could be recycled into laboratory landfill bins instead of the appropriate recycling bin. And changing this behavior, i.e. getting our laboratory personnel to properly and more consistently sort their waste, would mean more recyclables actually getting to the recycling, thereby increasing diversion, decreasing contamination, and ultimately addressing that problem we described in the first step. Now, in terms of who we're targeting, we're obviously interested in laboratory personnel in this instance, which includes staff, faculty, and students. The more specific we can get here, the better, because you can better craft an intervention that is much more tailored to your audience. But of course, we don't always have that luxury. And then lastly, ask yourself about the context in which your population behavior, right? So like I said, we're not generalists, right? We might recycle in one context where the issue is really front and center in our minds. We're really feeling our environmental identity, but not in another. So for us, it's important to note, for example, that lab personnel are often sorting their waste while they're conducting experiments, which means they're likely focusing less on things like recycling and more on things like curing cancer, right? So they've got their researcher hats on rather than their sustainability hats on. And waste sorting might be much less salient in this space. Okay, step 2, I hope you're writing things down and moving along with me here. You want to really try to understand the behavior that you're targeting. Jennifer really emphasized this. Assumptions are dangerous here, but many of you have the advantage of being embedded in the communities where you're implementing your interventions. So you have this opportunity to really lean in and learn from the people around you. Specifically, ask yourself and others what discourages or encourages the target behavior. Now, in our example, we just mentioned a barrier. Waste sorting simply isn't that salient in the laboratory context. Now, we also found that lab personnel struggled with a lack of time and knowledge, strong sorting norms, and in some cases, the recycling bins were inaccessible or inconveniently placed or too full. So on the other side of this coin, we found that reminders and embedded cues in the right place and the right time were helpful and encouraging factors, along with strong norms or expectations around sorting, as well as training and clear signage to help overcome knowledge gaps, as well as conveniently placed and regularly serviced bins. So how did we uncover these things, you asked? Well, we weren't just making educated guesses, right? We conducted literature reviews, observations, and surveys, and we used established frameworks and theories to help us understand sorting behaviors in our labs. So let's briefly talk about those. All right, so I'm going to start with the Fogg behavior model. BJ Fogg founded the Behavior Design Lab at Stanford, and according to him, behavior can be explained by three main things. Our motivation to undertake an action on a scale from low to high, so you can see this on the vertical axis here, and our ability to undertake an action on a scale from hard to easy, as seen on the horizontal axis here. And the prompts that we receive to undertake an action, you can see that floating there too. So importantly, this model really highlights how motivation and ability can be traded off. So for example, if motivation is very high, ability can be relatively low and vice versa. This really helps indicate when prompts might be effective or not, depending on how motivated we are and how easy something is to do. So for our purposes today, you can probably use this model as another way to think through your barriers and facilitators of behavior by asking yourself what motivates your audience to undertake a task and how strong that motivation might be, as well as how easy physically or psychologically the behavior is to undertake. In our lab waste example, I'd probably place us right about there where that red star is. We generally have an audience that cares about sustainability, and sorting lab waste is relatively easy for most lab personnel, with recycling bins and labels stationed in most of our labs. Now, part of the reason I feel relatively comfortable placing us on that figure is because we actually went out, we conducted observations in our lab buildings, we talked with lab personnel, and we released surveys to 2 of our large lab buildings specifically as part of that intervention. You can see on the little graph there that as part of those surveys, we asked about barriers, and bin location, a lack of knowledge, and unclear labeling were all leading barriers that our lab personnel identified. These surveys also covered other types of questions though. So we addressed topics related to the target behavior, like the frequency or the self-reported frequency of the action, norms, including what is typically done, as well as what should be done, different knowledge related to the target behavior, attitudes, beliefs, ease, convenience, exposure to messaging and communications, and a variety of other factors that might drive those pro-sustainability behaviors, like structural factors that might allow or impede the targeted behavior, access to landfill bins, recycling bins, or compost bins, for example. Now, because these are questions we often ask as part of our behavioral interventions at Stanford, we do have a quick guide with some sample questions that I'm more than happy to share with you. You can see a little screenshot of it there, and my hope is that you can come away from today with just a toolkit to enact your own behavioral interventions. You don't have to be an expert in survey design to do it. And I recognize that I'm really belaboring the second step in the checklist here, because I think diagnosing the behavior and understanding your audience as part of that is really a critical step that can impact the efficacy of your intervention, your nudge, your campaign, whatever it is you're designing. So to illustrate this, I'm going to show you a picture that our Associate Director of Zero Waste Systems sent my way. So get ready for this, folks. You're in for a real treat. And for those of you who are struggling to keep up, I'm buying you some time here. So hopefully you can continue to sort of write down your behavioral intervention steps as we go. Okay, so you can see here, I've got a picture. Let me walk you through this photo from a bathroom in one of our buildings. So first, I want you to take a look at this sign on the paper towel holder saying that these paper towels are, in fact, compostable. Now, let's go to the sign on the wall that says, please do not throw paper towels in this garbage. And then if I can direct your attention to the garbage in question, you'll see a landfill bin that is full of paper towels. Now, this is real life. I couldn't make this up if I wanted to. And I bring this example because almost every student I have, when presented with a behavioral challenge, like how do we get someone to better sort their waste, the first thing they say is, well, people just don't know, right? They nearly always start with this idea that it's an informational barrier that prevents someone from undertaking a pro-sustainability behavior. Now, there's all sorts of things going wrong with this picture. This is not something that we did, but rather that we documented. But I really want to highlight this photo because I think it challenges this assumption, you know, and it really shows just how ineffective an intervention can be when it incorrectly diagnoses the behavior. So there's a great article that highlights this point. And what the authors effectively demonstrated is that, yeah, providing information can be effective, but the effect is really mediated by the audience's values in the first place. So diagnose your behavior with great thoughtfulness. Don't be afraid to pull out that cognitive hierarchy model or other theories to think through some of the deeper drivers of behavior that often get less attention. All right, so let's move on to step 3 in our checklist, and let's jot down the outcome that you ideally want to see for your intervention. In other words, what is the impact or the effect that you want your intervention to have? And that's both on the issue that you're trying to address, which in our case is a decrease, right, in the amount of recyclables from our campus labs that are ultimately ending up in the landfill. And we also want to clarify outcomes for the target behavior that we're trying to change. So in our example, we want to see a decrease in the physical placement of recyclable items into laboratory landfill bins. Now, it may seem silly to distinguish between the impact on the issue and the target behavior here, but I began doing this because I found instances where there was really a disconnect, right, between the target behavior and the issue that we're trying to address. So for example, we were doing an intervention at a campus cafe where we did see an improvement in sorting behavior among most of our customers, but then someone who's cleaning the courtyard and surrounding area dumped all of the litter, leaves, and other rubbish from the courtyard into one of the cafe bins. So it really distorted the amount of landfill that we collected and audited that day. In that instance, we were seeing a change in the behavior across our target audience, but we weren't necessarily seeing a change in the issue. Now, the reverse can happen too, where the target behavior doesn't change, but issue outcomes improve. We've had interventions where general sorting behavior doesn't improve, for instance, but a single person will take on the responsibility of sorting others' waste, ultimately increasing diversion. So thinking through these potential disconnects can really help ensure that you're setting up your intervention in a way that actually addresses the behavior and the issue that you want to target. Now, additionally, and like I mentioned before, it's possible that it may actually be the underlying drivers of the behavior, your values, your norms, your attitudes, beliefs that you really want to influence and measure impact on rather than the resulting behavior. But for now, I'm just going to sort of move through into my favorite part of this intervention process, which is the design. All right, so put on your thinking caps for a second here, get your creativity out of the closet, ask yourself, what is your intervention actually going to be? Now, before I have you write something down, let me show you what I mean for this, just giving you some examples of what this could like, starting with what we did in our lab buildings. Now, labs are pretty high-risk spaces where we don't have a lot of wiggle room. So we ultimately went with signage, specifically these two forms of signage that provided details on sorting. One is more simple with fewer details, which you see on the left, and one more complex that really leaned into providing specific information, which you see on the right. Now, in both signs, we included normative messaging, which you can see at the top in bold, where we've written, we're scientists who care, followed by the use of dynamic norms, right? So i.e. we're referring to the growing number of residents taking action. And we've got a collective call to action, right? Where you see that with the join us. So by no means feel like your interventions have to be limited to informational signage. These tend to be relatively easy, low resource and low risk ways of shifting behavior, but there are lots of other ways we're promoting pro-environmental behavior on our campus. So start jotting an idea or two down. Think about what form your intervention will take, what behavior change techniques you use, and what your delivery methods might be. And while you're brainstorming that, I've got just a few waste-specific intervention examples from our campus that might provide a little bit of inspiration. Okay, so on the far left there, you can see two bin monitors at an event. These are students that we hired who are helping people, including me, to sort their waste. And these in-person interactions we've seen to be pretty effective, really effective, but also pretty time-consuming and resource-intensive. Next, events, and really in and of themselves can be considered interventions. This is a poster for a swap event that we hosted on our campus to encourage the community to donate and reuse items rather than sending them to the landfill. Scorecards, things like social comparison and other forms of feedback can also be forms of intervention. The example you see here is coming from a student project at the Stanford Redwood City campus where they sort of compared two groups of employees. Definitely had an effect. And of course, never underestimate the social media post and our greenfluencers, right? So this is an example from one of our students who is subtly encouraging our viewers to take part in our Give and Go program. And since it's Stanford and Silicon Valley, I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight the role of app. The screenshot is from here. This is created by a grad student as part of an ecopreneurship program on our campus. And the app asks users to take photos of their waste, and it uses AI to actually provide specific feedback and nudges to encourage better sorting. So of course, whatever you do, I really encourage you to think about that fifth step in our process, right? Which is developing the study design. So for those of you who are really resource limited, you can skip or scale back the step research, measurement, and assessment. It all takes a lot of time and resources. So if you're limited to designing and implementing a behavioral intervention based on best practices or research findings elsewhere, I totally hear you. I'm happy to step back, let you cook, do what you need to do. That said, human behavior is really varied and nuanced. We simply aren't generalists. So if you're looking for evidence here, there's a psychologist at Stanford, Dr. Michelle Gelfand. She's done some awesome work documenting and sort of creating a taxonomy for cultural differences. And it really demonstrates just how varied our behavior can be. So if I'm looking at research on an intervention in Japan, for example, and I'm hoping that applies to California, I might be out of luck. This makes developing a study design and assessing the impact of your intervention a really important part of ensuring that you're investing your resources wisely and actually having the effect that you intended. With that said, in our laboratory waste example, we really did want to assess the impact of our intervention. So we installed the simple design I showed you earlier across common spaces and labs in one of our campus buildings and the detailed sign in another. And to assess the effects of these signs on sorting behavior, we collected data both before and after the installation of the signs, including waste generation and contamination, and responses to the survey that I showed you earlier in the presentation. So jot down what you think you might like to do for your intervention, how you might want to measure it, and then let's talk about next steps. So that brings us through step 5 and the end of our preliminary exercise. So from here, you're really going to perfect that rough outline. Hopefully you have at least a few notes. I know we're moving super quickly here. But take that, work on it, and then you get to tackle step 6. This is relatively self-explanatory, right? You'll need to create scripts for your videos, develop your app, write your emails, design your signs, your training modules. And for this, it's often an iterative process. It can involve a lot of audience feedback, so don't underestimate the time it might take to get it right. But once you've got everything ready to go, it'll be time to pilot your intervention. And that's exactly what we did for our lab buildings. So because I can only assume you're on the edge of your seats here, wondering what happened in our pilot, I'm going to briefly cover that before we go. Okay, so both the simple and the detailed informational signs improved waste sorting at nearly the exact same rate. That additional information we included in the detailed sign, it didn't actually make much of a difference, but the signs did. We saw a roughly 10% decrease in contamination rates in our 2 pilot buildings. And my instinct is that much like the paper towel saga, right, that horrible picture that you saw before, this is likely because it was actually the normative messaging that we included that largely drove behavioral changes, not the information alone. But only 10%, you say, well, yeah, only 10%. And I hate to be a downer here, but spoiler, we don't even know if or how long that improvement might last. Often we see people habituate to signage and revert to former behaviors. So there's no guarantee that this improvement will last forever. But this is the reality of this work, and we tend to deal with pretty small effect sizes. But believe it or not, I was actually pretty happy with that finding. 10% isn't terrible. And it's really comparable to other signage-based interventions we've done on campus that are relatively low lift, right? They're cheap, they're easy for us to do. But you can imagine that even with that normative messaging, right, you can imagine why we're not seeing dramatic improvements. People are different. There's no silver bullet. There's really never a homogeneous population that is motivated or deterred by the exact same things. That said, our post-intervention survey did help us better understand what our intervention did and didn't address. So, for example, when we asked building occupants about barriers to sorting their waste, we did see a drop in the lack of knowledge, and literally no one mentioned unclear labeling as a barrier after those new signs were installed. That said, bin location increased as a barrier, at least relatively speaking, and roughly 31% of our respondents still cited lack of knowledge as a barrier. So clearly there's a lot of space for us to improve. The next thing I want to talk about is norms. The 2 questions you see here are ways that we get at measuring perceived norms. Interestingly, for both questions, i.e. how frequently do you think others sort their waste and how important do you think others sorting their waste is, we saw an increase in the average rating. More importantly, more respondents thought that waste sorting was more important and more common after the signs were installed. And while I certainly can't prove causation here, I do think this is a nuanced but important finding because research has really strongly established that norms guide our behavior. So if we think that our community commonly does something or socially approves of something, we are generally more likely to do that thing ourselves. Now, in talking about norms, we're actually starting to move our way down to some of those underlying behavioral drivers. And this really brings me to 3 ways we're addressing some of those behavioral drivers on our campus. And I recognize we are right at time here, so I'm going to go through these really quickly. The first one here is a PSA-style public communication campaign. We include a bunch of common messages across a suite of media. You can see an example from our Treasure the Tree campaign. There's a great article from 2000-ish by Renee Bader and Robert Cialdini that provides an awesome guide to designing PSAs. The second one here is a new program that we're launching this fall called the Sustainability Community Internship Program. You can see one of our amazing coordinators here in that central photo recruiting students. And the basic idea is that we train and pay a group of 20 or so students to be greenfluencers across our campus. And they really subtly engage their peers in sustainability through social media, through presentations, through student organizations. And then the last one on the list here is our very recently launched Sustainability and Culture Assessment. We worked really hard to design a survey tool that measures concepts that drive and predict behavior, including values, attitudes, and beliefs. We issue that survey each year to our matriculating and our graduating students. We just issued it to about 1,800 students from our class of 2025. So please stay tuned, get in touch if you're interested in this. These are some of the ways that we can really test those underlying drivers behind behavior. My time is totally coming to an end here. I want to leave you with a few personal recommendations before I go. If you're a podcast person, Hidden Brain and Think Fast, Talk Smart are both awesome podcasts that tackle a lot of the psychology that you'll need to implement successful behavior change interventions. We also have 2 faculty members at Stanford who have published a handbook of wise interventions. It's a really great guide if you want to spend more time on this. It's a wonderful way to go through what we touched on today. All right, so I'm going to call it a day here. I hope you learned something today. More importantly, I hope you feel inspired to do something good with the presentation and have at least a little bit of a head start on designing your own behavioral intervention that helps us save our planet one step at a time. All right, thanks.
Gretchen, lots of information there. Lots of great stuff. My hat's off to Stanford and all the work that you guys are doing. So thank you for sharing that. Jennifer, if you want to come on, we'll go ahead and do some questions. And just as a reminder, we will be posting the recording and the slides are going to be available online. We're going to send out an email tomorrow to everybody who's registered. So if you do need to drop off, just know that those are coming. We'll go ahead and stay on for another 10 or so minutes, just to take some of the questions that have come in the meantime. And I'll start off with one for we can go ahead and just turn off the slides at this point, Tyler. Gretchen, for you, question that come in just specific to what you were just talking about with the lab study. This is from Sharon. Did you document cost savings to the institution related to that? The 10% impact you mentioned, were you able to translate that into actual ROI financial?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. So in this case, no. We are continuing actually the study and we're going to be rolling this out across a few other buildings. So if you reach out to me in like 3 or 4 months, I can absolutely tell you cost savings. For these 2 buildings, it's relatively small scale, so it's not dramatically, the pilot isn't dramatically improving costs one way or another.
Got it. Thanks. There was an earlier question also for Gretchen from Nicole that was talking about what about SOPs or standard operating procedures type of a guide versus education for situations where there is the potential for dangerous material to make their way into the recycling or waste streams. Is the providing that information as part of an onboarding or training process more effective because of the context it's being communicated, or do you have anything to offer on that?
Yeah, so in the laboratory context in particular, we're obviously dealing with some pretty high stakes materials here. We do work really closely with environmental health and safety to deliver trainings, and we do often tackle both sustainability and health and safety in one. Sometimes, in fact, a lot of our laboratory personnel, I would say, tend to be more motivated by health and safety reasons than sustainability reasons. So we do try to tie those together in many cases. One challenge about those trainings that we see at the beginning of the year is that a lot of stuff happens, and then you're in that lab, you're in that moment, and all of that stuff kind of goes out the window. So we really want to combine those trainings with embedded cues and reminders and things in the moment that people are seeing in that instance. These are really crowded spaces. There's a lot of signage, there's a lot of rules, there's a lot of regulations. They're thinking about a lot of other things. So asking someone to recall something, even if they think it's important 6 months later, it can be pretty tough. And we tend to see a real decline in behavior over the course of the year, even when we've introduced something, like at a training in the fall when they're onboarded onto their labs.
And that's actually a good setup for a follow-up question I would give for either one of you, which is you can do messaging. Let's say you can have an impact getting people to respond to some sort of messaging in the moment, in that interim period that comes afterward. But as you just alluded to, Gretchen, oftentimes there could be sort of a drop-off over time. I know I've heard numbers in the past about how people need to receive a message or hear a message X number of times before it truly sinks in, or that you need to hear it from a different context and it has sort of a reinforcing point to it. Can either of you speak to, beyond what the message is, how to effectively communicate in a way that can lead to sustained behavior change and not just simply in that period when people first are exposed to it?
Sure.
You want to jump in, Jennifer?
I can comment a little bit, and then I think you could add on to it, Gretchen, based on your experience. So first, I think we always, whenever possible, want to be placing our messages close in space and time to where that behavior change happens. So if they're getting something through an email, but then the behavior change is happening in, say, the lunchroom, those are really disconnected. And as Gretchen mentioned, there's a lot of noise that happens. The second thing is that what we like to do is think about, especially for a repetitive behavior or something that's habitual, how long do we need people to pay attention to that message before it kind of just becomes what they do? And so a lot of times we'll talk to people who do things habitually and ask them about how long it took them to develop that habit, that we might learn that through observation or through surveys. And then we'll make sure that our signage stays fresh and in attention by swapping it out for that duration, because that's the ultimate goal, is that we don't need to keep telling people what to do every time, but that they, over time, learn this new habit. So, and I guess lastly is sometimes we don't know, because we do these pilots and we measure initially and we're not sure if behavior sustains. So whenever you have the resources to do so, I think continuing to measure and assessing when that drop-off happens can really kind of inform, I think, the greater field in providing more knowledge in that space. Gretchen, what would you like to add to that?
I think that was actually a great answer. If there's other questions, we can absolutely move on and tackle more.
Okay, great. We had one come in. What does, for either one of you, it's the research that speaks to using enforcement to drive behavior change. I know there's a little bit, Jennifer, you touched earlier about, and this a little bit, having actual regulation and requirements, but is there an advantage with whether notices of violation or actual fines? Again, I'm reading from this person's question. Are there situations where enforcement is more effective, such as the cases of extreme violations versus broad application? Is the potential for backlash something to consider also with that when you're trying to influence a wide audience and all?
Yeah, I mean, enforcement is effective, right? It can get people, but it will do it. If you're going to get a fine, you're going to get in trouble, you're going to have to pay. If you get caught, you're likely going to change your behavior. And there's some nuances to that. But I think the biggest consideration from my perspective is that enforcement-based approaches, or even on the flip side, incentive-based approaches, rely on extrinsic motivation. People are going to do the thing or not do the thing to get the prize or avoid the fine. they don't internalize that sort of, they don't develop a self-perception as I'm the kind of person that cares about waste reduction. So what happens is that incentive or that enforcement is tied to that one behavior, that one thing that they're going to be fined for. So I think it's really effective, but it's also really expensive. And some things it's just really hard to, sort of capture people and into act and do those and implement the fines. So I would say my perspective is that reserve that for the really bad doers, right? The really gross cases, and not do it as sort of a fallback approach. But Gretchen, if you feel free to add to that as well.
Give a really classic academic answer, which is totally, it depends, right? I do think enforcement can be a really good and a really strong, a really effective tool. It can be difficult, right? That is often not low-hanging fruit. At our university, we don't really have a political climate where offering a carrot or a stick is always an option. And per Jennifer's comment, I think sometimes those extrinsic motivations mean that when they are removed or when they are not properly enforced, that behavior totally shifts back. You could probably look up, and I'm happy if someone wants to shoot me an email, I can send you a collection of studies. There's some great examples with speeding, for example, and looking at whether or not getting a speeding ticket actually changes your speeding behavior. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it doesn't, right? So there are instances where enforcement is helpful. And part of the reason that I actually think it is helpful is because it is a really strong way to communicate norms, right? It's a really strong way to communicate what is socially acceptable behavior. And here we've all, as a society, sort of agreed on what those rules should be. So I don't think it's necessarily just about the fine, right? That can certainly help, right? But it is a really clear way to say, hey, we've all agreed on this, and this is how you are expected to behave. There are other ways to do that, right? That aren't necessarily a rule or regulation or a law. But I totally agree, Jennifer. I think they can be a good tool, maybe not the first one that you want to jump to, depending on your context, and certainly one that's not always popular.
Yeah. Great. Let me throw out one last question before we start to close out. And this just comes back to, you both alluded to this, that it can take a lot of effort to do these types of campaigns. And having worked, done education and all for a university many years ago, I know just the resources, the staff bandwidth, the ability to really do an in-depth, full going through all these steps can be a barrier for many communities. Is there advice, thoughts you would offer for folks in those situations of sort of the lower hanging fruits, things that you can do that bring in some of these principles, but are a little easier to access or take advantage of, that you would suggest?
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Okay. Yeah, that's always a challenge, I think, with varying budgets, limited budgets, or maybe you're one person and you're in charge of all of the sustainability efforts, which happens to include waste. So resources, I think, are one of the most common barriers. So I would say, first and foremost, don't just assume when you're creating campaigns. So almost always, even if you can't do the sort of research-driven identifying barriers and benefits and doing these pilots, start with looking at the literature, look at what others have done, look at universities and institutions that do have resources, what are they finding in terms of what works, and then ask yourself, to what extent is my context similar to that? Do we have similar types of infrastructure, likely similar barriers? And then layer on top of that get out of the office, get out of your conference room, boardroom, away from your Zoom, and go look at what's going on. Look into some bins, do some observations, do a few intercept surveys. In that barrier and benefit phase, simply just asking 2 questions. Are you doing this thing? What makes it difficult for you to do this thing? And what do you see as beneficial? And you ask that of 15, 20 people, you're much better off than had you just skipped the research step at all. So some observations, review of literature and case studies that others have done, and a few interviews. will set you up much better. Then the other thing is when you do have effective programs, it's useful, and something that we've been doing a lot, is to package those up into toolkits in which you've defined the context, the barriers, and the benefits, and said it, and making that available to others. So if your context is this, where you have these types of items, or this type of, say it's a bus stops, right, where the context is this, here's some strategies that we believe to work. So are already kind of pre-packaged for people. I think that's another way. And then they can test them and see how they work, but it's still better than just sort of starting from blank and starting, I think, which is what most people fall to, is, well, here's what would work for me. I'll just create something that would work for me or work for those in my office. And most of the time, the people we're trying to shift are very different than ourselves.
Yeah, certainly I hope these slides are shared. I think the brief overview that Jennifer provided of CBSM is a really useful starting place that is effectively free. The list that I developed that gets into that and asks you specific questions, I think it is another place where, take 30, 40 minutes, go through it with your team, talk to a couple of people, and I think you can at the very least start to design a pretty low lift intervention that way. I really embrace things like, the podcasts like The Hidden Brain and Think Fast, Talk Smart. They are totally free. They are really easy to listen to while you're folding your laundry or driving to work. I often assign them to my students in class in place of articles and reading, for instance. And so, I think, without taking a huge chunk out of your workday or your time, you can actually really inform yourself on some of the underlying psychological principles that make for good behavioral interventions. So I encourage you to use those. I will also say, I come from an academic research background. I work at a university now. And many of our faculty and our researchers, myself included, we are more than happy to field questions, right? And we get a lot of emails, but if there is an article that you want to see and it costs a lot of money, or you don't have that subscription to that journal, email the author. I'm telling you, most of them will get back to you and be like, here it is, right? So, I hope people don't hesitate to contact, Jennifer or myself after the webinar. I hope you don't hesitate to reach out to researchers, or to ask for some of the different articles that might help you better design a behavioral intervention. And as I mentioned, sort of in that 12-step process too, research and assessment is expensive. It's time consuming, right? So if you do want to rely on the best practices that you're seeing elsewhere, I think you can do that. I think it's okay to make some assumptions based on limited resources that something is going to work. We don't always have the luxury to hire a bunch of students or do, collect this data, do these surveys, do these waste audits, and that's okay. The one thing that I cautioned before during the presentation that I'll caution now is that context really matters with behavior. So be careful, if you're taking a lesson from one place, make sure you understand what some of those cultural differences might be that might make it less applicable. Again, Michelle Gelfand, which is one of the researchers that I mentioned, she has some great studies on culture and how cultures differ, and how different things like pandemic policies around masking look really, really different in different countries. So pay attention, try and find things. If you're looking for studies, try and find things that are from your country, your area, your state, maybe from your sort of organizational context where you can.
And use your gut level instinct understanding of your community and what your values are and how do you speak to those. Yeah,
talk to people too. Like people love, people like being asked questions. I think for the most part, I've had really good experiences with even informational interviews. So often those conversations or those observations, I'll tell my students in the first step, if they're designing an intervention in a cafe, like I'll give them $5 and they can go get a cup of fancy coffee and they can sit there and watch people, and it gets you a long way.
Yep. Great. Jennifer, Gretchen, thank you again. Tyler, if we can bring up the slide, I just have a couple slides I just want to go through real quick as we close out. Just remind folks, as I've pointed out a couple times, we will have the recording and the slides will both be available, archived on our website, along with some of these resources I've been putting into the chat. We'll send out an email to everybody who registered tomorrow so that you can find We also have a good 3+ year archive of past programs, with recordings from many different topics that you can see up here on your screen, including one we did a couple of months ago about labels and signage, building confidence, recycling, et cetera. So all these are on our website. There's a lot of great knowledge and information from our speakers past, and encourage folks to check those out on their own. And next slide. I will point out, so this is our last webinar of 2025. We're going to take the fall off, but I will point out for myself, I'm actually going to be on the road quite a bit over the next month and a half. So if you happen to be at any one of these conferences coming up, New Mexico Recycling Coalition, the ASHE Higher Ed Sustainability Conference in Minneapolis, Georgia Recycling Coalition, or the NYSAR 3 New York State Association Conference. I'll be speaking at each one of those on topics ranging from how we build confidence in recycling to doing waste audits and other topics. So I encourage folks to come out. If you happen to be there, stop by and say hello. Next slide. One more time, thank you, Jennifer TABANICO from Action Research and GRETCHEN ENGBRING from Stanford University. Lots of great information. You guys are doing great work. Keep it up. Thank you again for good. And with that, we will be, after you drop off the webinar, you should get a prompt. We encourage you to fill out just the quick 3-question Zoom survey. Give feedback for our speakers. We'd love to be able to share that with them directly. So if you can just take a minute to fill that out, would appreciate it. And that should automatically show up as soon as you drop off. And then, as I pointed out, for those of you who want to stick around, I'll go ahead and introduce my colleague, Sarah Hawthorne, who is a business development manager here with Busch Systems, who's going to talk through some of the bin products that we develop and sell here at Busch Systems. Sarah, if you're there, go ahead and turn on your camera.
Hi there, Alec.
Great, Sarah. Good. And Tyler can turn that off. Great. Sarah, how are you doing today?
I am wonderful. How are you, Alec?
I'm doing well. I will hand it over to you and let's take it from here. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Just want to say, again, another quick thank you to Jennifer and Gretchen for that amazing webinar, as well as Alec for facilitating everything. I hope that you are all leaving with some beneficial information. I know I have. And just wanted to quickly touch base. I am one of the business development managers here at Busch Systems. I primarily work within the hospitality and public admin sectors and have been with Busch for 8+ years. As we all heard throughout this webinar, that we here at Busch completely understand that every single internal program is not the same. We know that education, signage, labeling, consistency, are really important factors in regards to having a successful program, even down to capacities, placements, so many different options. So we truly love to touch base with our customers. We love to build those connections and relationships, and we love to help guide in any programs that we could help suggest any suitable products for any successful program. Here at Busch, we thrive in our customization. We understand that even every county, every city, municipality is different within their collection needs, colors, streams. So we are here to cater to those differences and help implement any type of education that we can, just to help our customers. We're not here just to supply the container. We're really wanting to hone in on those solutions for you on your end. And just wanting to touch base on a few different options that we have internally, as well as the different customizations. Here is our Spectrum unit, one of our top 3 selling series We have about 8 different capacities. And the beauty about these containers is that they are a modular system, which means they are all separate body that nest and stand nicely beside each other. But you have that ability to create any type of configuration that works for your internal collection needs. So we do suggest the restricted openings, the labels. We have some customers that are very heavily they like to use icons versus maybe listed verbiage in regards to their collections, especially if you're in a higher multicultural area. We do find that it's extremely successful to have those types of icons to help in the correct disposal. So we have our internal in-house graphics department that we can provide mock-ups and work with various different containers to help you visualize what would be the most beneficial for your end. So if you have a program that you're implementing and say that you find organics would do well in certain areas than just waste and recycling, you have that ability to create those configurations instead of having to repurpose a whole new system on your end. You kind of have that ability to create what works best for you. So we stock in mainly your blacks, blues, grays, greens. We also have customers that customize and wrap a whole container just depending on their event and their collection stream. This right here is our Waste Watcher system, extremely similar to our Spectrum with various capacities, as well as colored bodies, restrictive openings, and signage. So we do know that within a lot of public settings, it is required to have a solid lift lid. So we have swing options, lift options, and again, have the customization available to you as well. So we have sign frames here that if you want to add a logo or have a specific icon, we could also make that happen too. We do have a variety of accessories available, such as casters for easy transport and disposal. And this really helps in regards to the contamination as well. Those behavioral pain points are going to vary per customer, per setting. So any type of education, eye-catching information that we can help with, that is something, a great tool that we have to help with our customers for successful programs. This is one of our new containers here, and feel free to stop me if you have any questions. I just know everyone's been here for a while and just trying to go through some important factors and points. This is our mosaic unit. This is, again, is modular, and you can go anywhere from a single unit up to, we have customers that create 6 streams, just depending on your collection streams. So this is a full 360 signage, which is extremely important in regards to, you know, those behavioral of even when you're walking up to a stream or a disposal station, that you're not having to second guess yourself. You could, you know, you can pinpoint and you know naturally that you're going to go towards blue with the cans and bottles versus green for food scraps. So extremely popular with the customization as well. We have our stocked versions, but we've had customers that really spend a great deal of time in regards to their signage and their specific icons and verbiage that they use, and also commingling too, that you can use the restricted opening. We have solid lift lids that helps with that, putting that process of mine to correct disposal. And these are a 32-gallon capacity, as well as the optional casters for easy transport. But again, if you have a very specific design in mind, we'd be more than happy to provide a visual through our graphics department. As well as we have here, this is just an example of custom, you know, we have some customers that are truly, you know, wanting to keep that aesthetic look in their environment, but also want to put across their correct messaging in regards to your blues, greens, and blacks. This is a custom body decal that could be added and quoted accordingly, just depending on your specific customization. But a lot of our containers, you have that ability to create any configuration, as well as really talk about those pain points of colors versus non-colors versus restrictive openings. We have all those types of options that we're happy to discuss and touch base of what works well for your internal settings. As well as I do want to showcase, we do have the hot stamping options available. We have customers that again do listed, do logos, put icons. So this is just an example of a kitchen composter that is available, very popular for residential use. And if you want more of a permanent message across, but feel free to reach out to any of our business development managers here at Busch. We are more than happy to jump on the phone, have a Teams meeting, just to discuss in detail of those specific programs and pain points, and touch base to see how we can help solve some more of your solutions on your end in regards to crack disposal.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for everyone for attending this webinar today, and we hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.